For over a century, European cars were the undisputed definition of excellence. BMW, Mercedes, Audi, Volkswagen, these weren't just brand names, they were global status symbols. If you wanted the best, you bought European. Simple as that. But today, that legacy is cracking. The very companies that invented the modern automobile are staring down their biggest crisis in history, facing the risk of losing the entire car business. And the biggest shock? The threat isn't coming from Detroit or Tokyo, it's coming from China. What if the greatest threat to Europe's legendary car industry wasn't a foreign rival, but a grand plan born in its own capitals? In a frantic race for a green future and energy independence, European leaders lit a fire that now threatens to burn down their most iconic industry. This is the story of how Europe's ambition to save the planet accidentally created the perfect storm for its own automotive decline, leaving the door wide open for a new superpower in the car world. To get your head around the sheer scale of this crisis, you have to understand it wasn't one bad decision. It was a cascade of well intentioned policies that, when mixed together, created a perfect mess. It's a story in three parts: a green dream, an energy shock, and the arrival of a competitor that had been preparing for this exact moment for decades. First, the green dream. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, the European Union launched one of the most ambitious environmental projects in history, the European Green Deal. At its core was the Fit for 55 package, a sweeping set of rules designed to slash greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. For the auto industry, this came down to a seismic ultimatum: a mandatory phase out of all new gasoline and diesel car sales by 2035. From that day on, every new car sold had to be zero emission. On the surface, it was a bold statement on climate leadership. Europe was setting the global standard, but under the hood, it was an industrial earthquake. This wasn't a gentle transition, it was a forced march. Car makers who had spent a century perfecting the internal combustion engine were told they had just over a decade to completely re engineer their businesses, factories, and supply chains around a technology they hadn't even come close to mastering: the electric vehicle. The costs were, and still are, astronomical. We're talking hundreds of billions of euros in R&D, retooling entire plants that once built engines and transmissions, and retraining a workforce whose skills were suddenly on the verge of becoming obsolete. A McKinsey analysis projected that as EV adoption speeds up, parts from the combustion engine era worth an estimated $230 billion, mostly made in Europe, will become worthless. The industry, which supports nearly 14 million jobs across the continent, was officially put on the clock. This transition created immense financial strain. European car makers, many still reeling from the pandemic, were forced to divert huge sums of money away from their profitable gas and diesel cars to fund a high stakes, low margin bet on an electric future. They were suddenly fighting a war on two fronts, trying to squeeze profits from their old models while pouring billions into an EV transition where they were already falling behind. The result? A value over volume strategy. Since the pandemic, European automakers have been producing millions fewer cars per year, choosing to focus on high margin luxury models instead of mass market cars the average family can afford. This has led to underused factories and a shrinking production base across Europe. But the problems didn't stop there. Just as the industry was grappling with this government mandated whiplash, a second crisis hit: the energy shock. Following the tragic events in Ukraine in 2022, Europe made the geopolitically necessary but economically brutal decision to wean itself off Russian fossil fuels. The Repower EU plan was launched to end reliance on Russian energy by 2027. This meant banning coal, phasing out oil, and scrambling to replace the vast amounts of natural gas that powered the continent's industrial heart. In one sense, the policy was a success, speeding up the green transition. By 2024, a record 44% of the EU's electricity came from renewables. But this rapid, forced shift came at a staggering cost. The price of energy, especially for industrial users like car factories, went through the roof. Let's look at the raw data. In 2024, industrial electricity prices in the EU soared, averaging around 0 to 199 per kilowatt hour in some of its key manufacturing hubs. Now compare that to the competition. In the United States, it was just 0 to 0.75 per kilowatt hour, and in China, it was around 0 to $82. European factories were paying more than double what their main global rivals paid just to keep the lights on, let alone melt steel, press body panels, and run assembly lines. Suddenly, building a car in Germany, France, or Italy became fundamentally more expensive than building one almost anywhere else. High energy costs became a direct tax on manufacturing, eating into already thin margins and making it nearly impossible to produce an affordable EV that could compete globally. This created a massive paradox. Europe's policies were pushing for more electric cars, but they simultaneously drove up the cost of making those very cars. The stage was perfectly set for a new player, one that had been quietly building an insurmountable advantage for over 2 decades to walk right in and take over. While Europe was busy perfecting the 12-cylinder engine, China was playing a completely different game. For more than 20 years, Beijing has been methodically executing a grand strategy to dominate the future of the automobile. The goal wasn't just to build a better car, it was to control the entire ecosystem that makes an electric car possible. This unfolded in 3 phases: cornering the battery market, supercharging the industry with state subsidies, and finally launching an export invasion. Let's start with the heart of any EV: the battery. It accounts for up to 40% of the car's total price, making it the single most important part. While European automakers thought of themselves as engine builders, China saw the battery as the new engine and set out to control every single link in its supply chain. That's not an exaggeration. Today, China produces over 75% of the world's lithium ion battery cells. Two Chinese firms, CATL and BYD, control nearly half the entire global battery market. But their dominance goes way deeper than just final assembly. It extends all the way to the raw materials. China processes around 60% of the world's lithium and 70% of its cobalt. It controls 70% of the global capacity for cathodes and a staggering 85% for anodes, two of the most critical battery components. They've achieved near total supremacy over the more affordable LFP battery chemistry with a market share of over 95%, making Europe almost completely dependent on them for this technology. Simply put, you cannot build a competitive electric car today without relying on the Chinese supply chain. This makes Europe incredibly vulnerable. Geopolitical tensions or a flick of a switch on export controls in Beijing could bring European EV production to a grinding halt. It was a strategic failure of epic proportions for the West, which is now playing a desperate game of catch-up in a race China has already functionally won. But this dominance wasn't an accident. It was fueled by phase 2 of the plan, a tidal wave of state support that dwarfed anything in the West. For decades, the Chinese government nurtured its EV industry with a vast web of subsidies, not just consumer tax credits, but cheap loans from state-owned banks, massive government grants, and access to land and materials for less than market value. This allowed companies like BYD, which started as a battery maker in 1995 with just 20 employees, to grow into a global giant. It created a protected home turf where these companies could scale up, refine their tech, and achieve efficiencies that are now impossible for outsiders to match. China's domestic market now accounts for more than half of all EV sales globally, with electric cars making up almost 50% of all vehicles sold in the country in 2024. 6 of the world's top 10 EV makers are now Chinese. That immense scale gives them a cost advantage that European manufacturers, with their high labor costs and soaring energy prices, simply can't touch. Which brings us to the final phase, happening right now: the export invasion. Having achieved supply chain dominance and unmatched economies of scale, Chinese automakers are setting their sights on Europe, and they're showing up with cars that are often just as good as their European rivals, but for a fraction of the price. The leader of this charge is BYD, which stands for Build Your Dreams. The company is a case study in vertical integration. While European brands wrestle with complex supply chains, BYD makes everything itself, from its own batteries and semiconductors to the final car. This gives it a level of cost control that is unheard of in the industry. The result is a massive price gap. Some analyses suggest a Chinese EV can be built for tens of thousands of euros less than a comparable European model, and now they're bringing that cost advantage to Europe's doorstep. In the first half of 2025, sales of Chinese car brands in Europe exploded, growing by 91% compared to the previous year. Their market share nearly doubled from 2.7% to 5.1% in just 12 months. BYD's sales have surged, with some reports showing year-on-year increases of over 200% through August 2025, even outselling Tesla in multiple months. Look at their strategy. They aren't just shipping cars from China, they're embedding themselves in Europe, BYD is building its first European car factory in Hungary. It's a brilliant move. By producing cars inside the EU, BYD can sidestep import tariffs. The EU has a standard 10% tariff on cars, but after an anti subsidy investigation, it slapped additional duties on Chinese EVs, bringing BYD's total tariff to around 27%. Building a factory in Hungary effectively neutralizes that barrier, letting them compete on a level playing field but with a fundamentally lower cost base. Although the Hungarian plant has been delayed to 2026, the intent is crystal clear. BYD is also building a massive dealer network across 19 countries and spending a fortune on marketing, even sponsoring huge events like the European Championship soccer tournament. This is the end game of China's 20-year plan. They control the resources, they have the scale, they have the cost advantage, and now they're building a Trojan horse inside Europe's own borders. The very policies designed to create a green future for Europe have, through high costs and a rush timeline, created the perfect entry point for a competitor that is now positioned to own that future. If the story so far sounds alarming, the raw data reveals a situation that's even more critical. This isn't some distant threat. The numbers show the foundations of Europe's auto industry are cracking right now. Jobs are disappearing, market share is vanishing, and the leaders of Europe's most storied brands are openly warning of a collapse. Let's start with the market itself. The shift to electric isn't going as planned. Demand for EVs has been sluggish in some of Europe's biggest markets, weighed down by high prices and a lack of affordable options. As Renault CEO Luca De Meo bluntly put it, the European middle class is losing purchasing power, and without them, the whole industry suffers. Into this affordability vacuum has stepped China. While legacy European brands focused on premium EVs, Chinese brands are flooding the market with competitive and crucially affordable alternatives. Chinese brands captured a record 11% of Europe's EV market by mid-2025. In the first half of the year alone, their sales in Europe surged by 91%, reaching over 347,000 vehicles. By June 2025, Chinese brands as a whole had surpassed Mercedes-Benz in total monthly sales across Europe. The impact on competitors is brutal. Tesla, once the undisputed king of EVs, has seen its European market share plummet, with sales falling by as much as a third in the first half of 2025. Data from August 2025 shows BYD outselling Tesla for the second month in a row in the EU. This isn't a niche trend, it's a complete reshaping of the competitive landscape. This erosion of market share is having real-world consequences. The combination of high energy costs, lower production, and the switch to EVs, which require fewer workers to build, is leading to massive job cuts. In 2024 alone, 88,000 job cuts were announced across the sector. Giants like Volkswagen, Stellantis, and suppliers like Bosch have all announced freezes or closures, especially at plants built for old gas car technology. This has put Europe's legacy automakers in an impossible position. They're trapped. On one side, they face the ironclad 2035 deadline from Brussels, forcing them to abandon their most profitable products. On the other, they face a Chinese competitor that can produce comparable EVs at a much lower cost, making it incredibly difficult to compete. This desperation is now spilling out into the open. Industry leaders are sounding the alarm. Ola Källenius, the CEO of Mercedes-Benz, has warned that the industry needs a reality check on the 2035 ban, cautioning that if it's rigidly implemented, we are heading at full speed against a wall. He even warned it could lead to a collapse of Europe's car market. The CEO of BMW called the ban a big mistake. These aren't just gripes, they are pleas for realism from leaders who see the numbers and understand the existential threat they face. The final gut punch is the stark contrast with Europe's rivals. While Europe kept its market open, the United States took a far more protectionist route. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act provides huge subsidies, but only for vehicles with batteries and parts sourced from North America or trusted partners. This has effectively locked Chinese automakers out of the U.S. market. Europe, meanwhile, has been slower and more divided. It did impose tariffs, but they are seen by many as too little, too late, and were opposed by countries like Germany, which fear retaliation from China. The picture is grim. Market share is bleeding away. Jobs are disappearing. The industry's own leaders are warning of collapse, and its main competitors are shielded by protectionist walls that Europe has been unable or unwilling to build. This is a pivotal moment, not just for an industry, but for the economic future of an entire continent. The decisions made in the next few years in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris will decide whether Europe's automotive legacy survives or becomes a museum piece. If you think this story is important and that more people need to understand what's at stake, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us continue to bring these critical issues to light. We're standing at a historic crossroads. For a century, the heart of automotive innovation beat in Europe. The roar of a German engine, the elegance of an Italian design, these were the standards the world looked up to. Today, that legacy is threatened by a crisis largely of Europe's own making. The story of how we got here is a tragic irony. It started with noble goals: lead the world against climate change and break free from Russian energy. But the policies, the 2035 ban, and the scramble for energy independence created a perfect storm. They forced a rushed, wildly expensive industrial pivot that automakers weren't ready for. They sent energy costs soaring, crippling manufacturing, and they created a wide open, unprotected market for affordable EVs, a market that China, after 2 decades of masterful planning, was perfectly positioned to conquer. The European auto industry is now caught in a vice, squeezed from above by its own regulations and from below by low cost competition it currently has no answer for. The numbers don't lie. Market share is falling, factories are threatened, and the very idea of a mass market European car is at risk. The question now is whether this is the beginning of the end or the brutal wake up call the industry needed. Can Europe's legendary car makers, the pioneers of the automobile itself, innovate their way out of this corner? Or will the motor shows of the future be filled with the quiet hum of cars designed and built by the new automotive superpower? The next few years will tell the tale.